Okay, the United States notes. They got their start at a very unusual time for this country when the United States is having to define its own identity and trying to decide how it would be in the future. So this was in the midst of a war that almost tore this country in two. Well, I guess for a few years it really did have it torn in two. But soon enough, they managed to gradually pull themselves back together again. But so separate were they at that time that each of the two sides had to invent their own separate monies. Now, both already had monies, what we would sometimes call the broken banknotes. That was their paper money, and of course all shared the same coins and pretty much shared all the same coins even as they were separate. Except, of course, there really wasn't a lot of coins in circulation for the simple reason that coins were being hoarded by everyone, feeling very naturally insecure because of the war, not knowing who would win and what that would mean. But as you can see, as our paper money, since this is a series on paper money, and in particular, I'm kicking off a series on what I call the United States note, a history of the United States note. It got its start in 1862. This is not the earliest money, even on the North, where in 1861 there was the demand notes, and also a few interest-bearing notes. I don't even have I haven't even seen pictures of some of the 1861 interest-bearing notes, so we don't know much about them. But very shortly thereafter, the demand notes were replaced with the legal tender, and that's what has continued clear, well, until the 70s as far as being printed, and the 90s, at which point legally they ceased to be anything that had to be operated as money. Other than that, they remain legal tender. So you can see that we still had to do the same denominations as always. Both sides pretty much. They each invented their own. And starting with the Union side, this here, this $1 1862, where is that? There we go. Act of July 11, 1862. The United States will pay to the bearer $1 at the treasurer in New York. And then this is authorized by Washington, and it says August 1st. Let me see. Let's look at a few others of these. Maybe we can see another date that'll make sense. Oh, it's harder to read. Well, one more. If we don't see it, I give up. Well, I have different dates. Okay, yeah, because the $1 and $2 were a different date. Okay. Anyway, August 1862, $1 and $2, because they started a little bit later than the higher denominations. In fact, this was really the first $1, since the demand notes and interest-bearing notes did not descend down to any denomination below $5 for the demand notes, or $10 for the interest-bearing notes. So 1 and 2 here started with this. So this is, it doesn't say a legal tender, it just is a legal tender, other than in the definition on the back, which it defines itself pretty nicely here. This note is a legal tender for all debts, public and private, except duties on imports and interest on the public debt, and is receivable in payment of all loans made to the United States. Wow. Actually, I wish I could really pull in the detail. Every one of these little ovals around the number 1 in this giant circle has an enormous amount of detail. You can kind of get a taste of some of the kind of detail in this whole pattern, though. So, $1. And that was There's Salmon P. Chase. He was very much alive and had solved the problem. The North had to raise about $450 million to wage this civil war that they were fighting against the South, having decided to secede and create their own country. Now, just as those aren't the earliest, these Confederate notes also aren't. Indeed, if anything, they're kind of the opposite extreme. They're the last final and I think most mature phase of their money before it would all completely lose all value until nowadays, when they now begin to have numismatic value again, but not treasury value. So that's a really good picture of him. I'd have to look up to see who he is. Now, the Confederacy was really under the belief that they would eventually achieve their independence, even as the whole group of the United States had achieved its independence from England in time of living memory. Because there were people who had been alive during the wars of the late 1700s, and they'd be very old. But there'd be some old-timers who could remember that victory when the British conceded that we're going to be our own country and not merely some colonies of theirs. But they hoped and expected to achieve the same thing. 2 years after the ratification of a treaty of peace between the Confederate States and the United States of America, the Confederate States of America will pay to the bearer on demand $1. Look at that. You can actually see here Keys and Ball, Columbia, South Carolina. Wow. And then there's also a lithograph by Evans and Cogswell. So you can see the uneven cuts that often happen when they had to just cut these things manually, practically with like scissors. In those days, they didn't even bother trying to do a backside. All you get is what bits of ink kind of grind through or soak through to the back. So that was the $1. So we'll just march up all the way through. The $2, as you can see, has Alexander Hamilton on the front. And many of the same things. Washington, August, I can't tell if it's a 4 or 11 or what. Act of July 11th, 1862. Pay to the bearer again. And you can see Chittenden and Spinner's signatures there. And again, the same thing. Well, loans made, yeah, these are the same things said by the on the $1. Again, there's this enormous amount of detail. Now, just to comment a little bit further, with just the exception of the big denomination, the large and very large denominations of the Union money, everything here is real, except for those. So all the Confederate pieces are real, and the Union pieces, $1 through $20, are all real. So now here we have the $2. See, his image looks pretty good. Well, sort of. They all have the same onion paper, the same cutting. That's for register, that's for treasurer. See, they had their own register and treasurer. Just as the South had its own president and vice president, they had a Senate of their own and a representatives. Indeed, they had a constitution of their own, which was almost the same as that used by the North, with the one exception that it made a little bit more room for, slavery. Now here you see again the back of the $2 was just plain, so there's nothing really to see there. And that was the next thing they had. Going up. Now the $5, let's start with the Union here. $5, look at that. You can see Chittenden and Spinner's signature, nice and large. Not sure who that would be, but that's okay. United States promised to pay To the bearer, $5. Washington, March 10th, 1862. Payable at the Treasury of the United States at New York. Well, they couldn't say payable in any Federal Reserve Bank because that simply did not exist yet. But there's the $5, and it's kind of interesting to see how how similar it looks to the original demand note for this denomination, except it would say on demand, and then on the back would be completely different. Now, here we don't talk about loans to the United States. So now it's a legal tender for all debts, public and private, except duties on imports and interest on the public debt, and is exchangeable for U.S. 6% 20-year bonds, redeemable at the pleasure of the United States after 5 years. So that's what they call the original obligation. So, so that's what they had there. Now, meanwhile, for the Confederate, $5. Okay, there's a historic building 2 years after the ratification of a treaty of peace. See, they figured surely in 2 years we'll be at peace with each other and we can, acknowledge each other's money and at least get along. But until then, they had to use their own. Now, 5 actually has a reverse, the same rather intricate pattern all over. 5 and 5 in there, and very intricate pattern. Okay, so the next denomination up is the $10, and there's Abraham Lincoln printed when he was still alive. It was only afterwards they would have a law to say, no, if you're alive, you're not allowed to be on American money. But at that time, Lincoln was still alive, and nobody said, hey, you can't do that. So there he is. It's mind-boggling to think, there's some possibility, however slim, he might personally have even handled this note with his own face on it. But it's all the same thing. Payable at the Treasury of the U.S. at New York. So, Register of the Treasury and Treasurer of the United States. Again, we got Chittenden and Spinner. Spinner's got the most extraordinary autograph. And also, there's our red Treasury sticker. Always red. And March 10, 1862. And again, here's the back of these. And again, the 20-year bonds. So that's the original obligation. Okay. Now, Confederate had theirs. Now, this piece has a kind of interesting bit of personal history. Unlike the others, which I have purchased, this one has simply been in the family since before Confederate money was seen as anything more than an interesting but worthless souvenir. So this is an actual $10 that has never changed hands since it would have been obtained as money. But there you can see it has the same complicated pattern. It's been through a few more adventures, but I always value that because of its place in the family. Now, then we get to the $20. And again, a real $20 note. Here's our red seal, $20. The United States promised to pay $20 to the bearer. And so, it doesn't mention New York. Now, they have these things where they kind of go around in circles, but look at that. It's really intricate what those things say. United States in each of those. Same thing here. Because, of course, this was the United States. National Banknote Company. Yeah, they had to have a lot of other things. What's kind of neat, the spinner, at the very bottom of the loop, actually curves down to the top. That's kind of a neat little detail. And in the back, here's the same thing. Payment of all loans made to the United States. So these were like legal tender. And the neat thing is they continued as legal tender. That at least they are in a certain very real sense legitimate money as seen by the Treasury. Well, he's got a rather angular face. Here's their $20. Again, it's got a lot of the same looks to it. And they have this back. I like the way they put 20 in there so neatly. Okay. Now moving up. The next denomination up, what I have here for the Union, the United States, is this simulation copy. You see, this is only a simulation. Up until this point, everything's been an actual artifact from the time. But these get kind of rare and expensive, and so I haven't been able to. But this is what it looks like. And on the back, this is what this looks like, too. It's a legal tender. Okay, it's a 6%, 20-year bond. So this shows that at the pleasure of the United States after 5 years. Interesting. They figured after 5 years things will be stable enough. But actually that's a little more realistic. It gives you time to really make sure that the country is in a viable condition to be able to honor that in some ways. So, meanwhile, the Confederate was getting more use out of its larger denominations. This is their $50. I think that's their president there, but I'm not sure. Anyway, whose name escapes me at the moment. But anyway, there's $50. Like those nice 50s. Kind of interesting, kind of a similarity. They both have these $50 things on each side. So that's kind of neat. And on the back again, 50. They fit the 50 in there very nicely. And there's this pattern, very complicated. So you can see all the $50. And the next denomination up would be the $100. Again, this is a simulation. Not real, but this shows what it looks like for educational purposes. $100. Big, very impressive looking eagle. And lots of hundreds. And sometimes like there and there and there. And there's little letter C's, because C is for cents, was, 100. Okay, a bunch of C's in a circle around here. Same legal tender. There we go. And again, all these little complicated patterns. Look at that. Treasury, U.S. Treasury. That's who it belongs to now. This is the $100 for the Confederate. And so, wow. You can actually see there's a lot of detail there. Okay, $100. Now, of course, they had much more runaway inflation than the North, but the North had some too, because it wasn't sure if either side, let alone both, would be able to be redeemed in their value in gold. You have to remember, face value, this was supposed to mean like $500 in gold. Now, when you consider that $20 gold pieces is $100 times 5, that's to be 25 $20 gold pieces. This is supposed to be as good as that. Well, they didn't have anywhere near that much gold, so they printed these things in the hope that one day there would, or eventually what ended up happening is I think they got to a bit of a reserve currency, at least certainly for this, where there was enough gold on hand that as long as most people are content with the paper, they can just use the gold. That made these things literally as good as the gold that could back them. But they could only get all the way back up to that value in 1879. Be that as it may, however, this is what the $500 bill of the North looks like. Now for the South, we actually have to certify this one because it's rare enough and easy to counterfeit. And it's best to have a real picture here and really certify this thing. Nice high grade $500 Confederate States of America, but it says all the same things. For register, for treasurer, there's these signatures, there's somebody's picture, symbol here, there's kind of the Confederate battle flag. And look at that, more the drum and the trumpet, cannonballs, Dio, Vindici, God vindicates. Well, unlike these others, a 500 is blank on the back. So Oh, yeah, I just noticed in the back of the 100, I didn't get the 100. Look at that little squeeze. They actually managed to squeeze in 100, just barely. Wow, that's pretty nice. Okay. Now, the Union went one more denomination up, which was given that it didn't even inflate as much, is really a pretty good chunk of change. And that would be the 1,000. And again, now here, this is obviously simulation. I just about have to have something you get from a museum. There's like 2 or 3 specimens out there owned by private citizens, and the rest are all held by museums. But it would all have the same familiar red seal. Like all of the United States had the familiar red seal. Only the interest-bearing of 1861 and the demand notes had a signature, the way the Confederates simply continue to have signatures all the way till the end. And that completes the money, and that is also the first and most important cycle of the United States notes. And so the United States notes were very much about fighting the war, and in honor of all of that, and of the victory, and of the trust American soldiers and others had to put in this printed paper money, that it would hopefully one day be worth at least something, and maybe even ultimately its face value in gold. It's been a policy and remains a policy that all of those are still legal tender. Of course, they're worth so much more than numismatic items, you'd be nuts to turn it in at its face value. But they remain obligations of the U.S. Treasury. The Confederates, of course, as the Confederacy disintegrated and lost and died out, became just so much paper to burn or not really care much about. They became worthless, sort of like the money in the Weimar Republic there after World War I, or things that have happened in Venezuela and Zimbabwe in more recent years. The Confederate money became valueless, except now as numismatic items. Thanks for listening.